Hello, this lecture is on the new ideas that were coming into Joseon, Korea. So you may remember when we talked about Jung Do-jun, I was talking about how he was a follower of Neo-Confucianism. And increasingly over time, Neo-Confucianism is going to be the orthodoxy followed by the Joseon dynasty. And it's going to come to shape society in a lot of very important ways. So we need to talk a little bit about what Neo-Confucianism is. So first of all, you may recall when we talked about Confucianism earlier, we talked about the focus on human relationships and the virtues that govern those relationships. So that stays basically the same. You're still going to have this kind of Confucian relationships governed by virtues. That's still kind of the focus. But what's going to happen is, in a large part, and I'll talk about this momentarily, because of contact with Buddhism, Confucianism will seek to develop a metaphysics that explains those relationships and virtue. And it's important to note, Confucius was not very concerned himself with metaphysics, and metaphysics is just kind of a fancy way to talk about existence. He was not really interested in philosophizing about the nature of existence and things like that. He was more interested in these practical problems of how human beings should relate to each other. But like I said, in kind of competition with Buddhism, Confucianism will develop a metaphysics that explains how the world works and what the nature of existence is and so forth. And the Neo-Confucian description of this, and it's kind of illustrated here in this image here, which I just want to include to give you an idea of how Neo-Confucians kind of saw the world. They understood the world and existence itself to be governed by principle, or you could also say pattern. They thought there was this kind of cosmic pattern that just defines existence, that defines what makes a person, what makes an animal, what makes a plant. And what happens is there's stuff in this world, like material stuff, like just stuff, and that stuff adheres in different ways, kind of coagulates in different ways in accordance with cosmic pattern. So when that stuff coagulates, comes together in like a certain way, it becomes a bird, and when it comes together in another way, it becomes a rock. When it comes together in another way, it becomes a human. And so you have this stuff in the world that adheres together in certain ways to make different objects, different things that exist in accordance with this kind of cosmic pattern with principle. So I know it's kind of complex, but you have kind of a pattern, right? And then stuff coagulates into particular objects in accordance with that pattern. And when you die, the stuff that made you up kind of gets recycled, right? As the body decays, that stuff that makes you up gets recycled into new stuff in accordance with principle. Now, here's the thing. Since human beings were created according to a certain principle, a certain pattern, we need to act in accordance with that pattern, right? We need to act in accordance with that pattern. So you're made of stuff that coagulated in accordance with the principle of humanity. You need to make sure you act as a human being should act. And if you do that, if you take your part in the cosmic pattern, if you adhere to principle, everything will go well. So again, you can kind of think of this is this understanding of the universe as essentially in harmony. And when you act in harmony with the universe, things operate the way they're supposed to. If you do not act in accordance with this pattern, with this harmony, things will not go right. And you can kind of think about it like an orchestra, right? If everyone plays their part properly, you get beautiful music. But if someone doesn't play their part properly, it messes everything up. You can think of it like a sports team as well. If you follow the rules correctly, things go well. If you don't follow the rules correctly, things won't. But the understanding here is that these aren't human-made rules. This is the nature of the universe that determines these rules. So, we make the rules of a sports game. We could change those rules. We decide what the tune is. We could change the tune for an orchestra to play. But this is not something that you determine, right? These principles are things that are determined by the universe itself, and you as a human being should act in accordance with them. So what this means then is that the laws of morality and the laws of nature are the same, right? When it rains, that's just the natural world acting in accordance with the cosmic pattern. And virtue, morality, is the same cosmic pattern but operating with human beings. So it's key to understand this. They would understand morality as like how we would understand a scientific law. They did not differentiate between those two things. So we might say, well, this is science. This determines, when it's going to rain. But human relationships, those are determined by society, and they can change over time. For a Neo-Confucian, they would say, no, 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 no. It's the same thing. When it rains is determined by the cosmic pattern. Human relationships are also determined by the cosmic pattern. Just as you cannot change the rules about rain, you also can't change the rules about how human beings should relate to each other. So this created an absolute foundation for morality. Morality is something that you discover, in a sense. It's predetermined by the fundamental nature of the universe. It's not something that human beings create. Right? Today, in American society, there's a lot of people who would understand themselves as cultural relativists or moral relativists that would say morality changes, and it's basically human society that determines morality. A Neo-Confucian would disagree with that idea. They would say that the rules of morality are determined in the very nature of the universe, and therefore they cannot be changed. In a Neo-Confucian government, the government exists to help people develop this morality. So, for example, again, to make a kind of contrast for an American, you may say the job of the government is to provide different social services, to bring economic development, and things like that. But you would probably maybe say, but the government should not be concerned with personal morality, at least insofar as it doesn't directly impact other people. And in Neo-Confucianism, they would say, no, no, personal morality impacts everything. Because when something's out of harmony, it throws off the whole, right? So just as an instrument that's not playing properly throws off the orchestra, when a person doesn't follow proper morality, that throws off all of society. So the job of the government was to help develop this morality among the people. That was the primary job. So sometimes you may hear someone in an argument in the United States say, you can't legislate morality, right? You can't legislate morality. In Neo-Confucianism, they would say that's the most important job of the government, is to encourage people to be moral. And they would call this a kind of civilizing transformation, right? Civilizing transformation. We're going to make people be moral. What's fascinating about this is it turns Buddhism on its head, right? Neo-Confucians borrowed, or they were kind of pressured in a sense, in competition with Buddhism to develop metaphysics. We talked about earlier how Buddhism and Confucianism were kind of complementary, but some Confucians did not like Buddhism, and we'll talk more about why that is later. But in order to compete with Buddhism, they needed to develop a metaphysics, because one thing about Buddhism is it has this very deep philosophy that explains how existence works. So please bear with me for a second, because this is a little bit confusing, because Buddhists use words differently than they're kind of used normally or commonly in English. But in Buddhism, it's understood that things are not real, right? Things are not real. So the computer or that you're watching this lecture on, from a Buddhist perspective, they would say that's not real. And you may say, well, wait a second, how's it not real? I can touch it. That's not what a Buddhist means when they say it's not real. What they mean when they say it's not real is it will change. Eventually, that computer will no longer be a computer, right? It will eventually break. It will eventually be recycled. It will eventually just kind of be broken up into its component bits. So for Buddhists, they understood everything that is not permanent as unreal, because it will one day change, right? So basically their argument was that reality is an illusion. What seems to be real is an illusion. It will change. And if you try and base your happiness on that illusion, you're going to be miserable, right? That's Buddhism in a nutshell, right? In Buddhism, they argue that things change, and that's what they mean when they say things are unreal. And if you try and base your happiness on things that change, you'll never be happy, because those things will change, they'll be gone. So that's why you should try and transcend this world. That's why you should go beyond this world of illusion to the true reality, right? That's kind of the Buddhist perspective. What Neo-Confucians did was they kind of accepted some of these ideas, but they reversed it. They argued that reality is change, right? Instead of saying change makes it so things aren't real, Neo-Confucians said reality is change. The nature of the universe is to always be changing in accordance to this harmony, this cosmic principle, this cosmic pattern. So change is reality. Reality is change. It doesn't mean that the world is unreal. It's just that the inherently the world is always changing, and your job is to change in principle in harmony with that world. And this sounds kind of complex, I know, but basically what the Neo-Confucians were arguing was we can therefore focus on this world. Buddhism has at its heart this idea Buddhism has as its heart this idea that reality is, or what appears to be reality, is fundamentally unreal, and then therefore you should focus on enlightenment, which is basically kind of escaping this illusion. Neo-Confucian said there's nothing illusionary about the world. The world is real. Change is just the one constant in the world. So basically, Neo-Confucians are trying to argue against Buddhism that change is real, that reality is change, and that's fine. So therefore, we need to focus on this world of change, change with the world in accordance with that cosmic pattern. That doesn't mean morality changes. It just means that I may have to do different things at different times based on that cosmic pattern, but I should always be focused on this world. This world, for Neo-Confucians, is where it's at. And if you had a little trouble with the metaphysics, don't worry, it's complex. The key thing is the Neo-Confucians are arguing, they've developed a kind of metaphysics to argue that this world should be the focus. And they're trying to counter the Buddhist idea that this world is unreal and enlightenment, individual enlightenment, should be the focus. Now, one thing about Neo-Confucians was that they were very concerned with ritual. Neo-Confucians were very concerned with ritual. And this is important. They understood ritual to make people moral by embodying the correct principle. So a lot of times I think Americans, when they use the word ritual, they mentally include the word empty. And there's this idea people say, well, that's just symbolic, or that's just a ritual. Again, that would not make sense to a Neo-Confucian. For them, ritual doesn't just express what you feel. It actually makes you more moral by engaging in the ritual. And I'll give you an example shortly. But the idea here is that ritual is important. It's not empty. Performing the correct rituals is important because when they're performed correctly and when you follow the correct form, they embody the correct principle. They embody the relationships that are inherent in the cosmic pattern. And by participating in them, you become more moral. So Neo-Confucians were very concerned with making sure that people followed the correct rituals and performed them correctly, because those would help make you more moral. So the idea is this: rituals transform the people who partake in them. So, and like I said, this is very important. They didn't think that rituals were only symbolic. They thought that they made a real change. So for example, when you graduate, you'll walk across the stage and you'll receive a diploma, you'll shake the president's hand, people will clap. That's not simply expressing the fact that you've graduated. That ritual will be understood to somehow transform you. Right? That ritual is not simply an expression of the fact you graduated. It would transform you if the ritual was organized correctly and if you participated in it correctly. For Neo-Confucians, there were four main rituals. Right? For Neo-Confucians, there were four main rituals. The first was capping, and this marked when a boy received an adult hat and marked his becoming a man. Notice, and one thing that's interesting, there's not really an equivalent female version of this. This is for boys. So you can see one issue with Neo-Confucianism, it tends to be very patriarchal, male-focused, right? It has these four main rituals. One of them excludes women. The second important ritual was marriage. So marriage was very important. Remember, this is a society without a social safety net, really. When you got old, who took care of you? Your children did. Who helped you work on the farm? Your children did. So marriage was very important, and it was understood not so much as about love. They would talk about how affection would develop, but it wasn't about love. You oftentimes did not choose the person you married. That was chosen for you. But ideally, over time, as you lived together, as you dealt with difficulties together, you would develop affection for each other. But a lot of the main purpose of marriage is economic, right? Because men and women have different roles in society. They're going to have to perform, and they both need children to take care of them when they're older. This has an economic function. The third ritual would be funerals and mourning. In Confucianism, you should respect your ancestors, especially your parents, because they gave you life. And so you would conduct funeral rituals when they die, but also you should mourn. Now, one thing about mourning, and you can kind of see that here, notice this man here is leaning on a cane and he's wearing this kind of clothing. This is clothing made of hemp. And the idea was when your parents die, you should be so upset and so miserable, and you should also feel guilty because you should have kept them alive, right? Very, very strict Neo-Confucianism is, right? If they would have lived longer if you were a better child. You should be really unhappy and regretful. So you should wear clothing that's uncomfortable. Hemp clothing is not nearly as comfortable as silk. Definitely you don't get to wear silk when your parents die. You should be so upset that you can't stand without a cane. There was a saying that the grass should not grow around your parents' grave because you should be out there leaning like on their grave, crying and weeping all day because you're so sad that they have died. So this was a very important ritual in Neo-Confucianism, and ideally you did this for 3 years. And if you were a government official, a lot of times you would retire during this time period to mourn your parents when they die. And you did this both for your father and your mother, right? Your mother, even though this is a patriarchal civilization, you still were supposed to honor your mother in this way. So this was a very important ritual, and this was meant to emphasize your regret at having lost your parents. And of course, this shows that you, like I said, this would build up in you this virtue where you're concerned. Now, after the 3 years of mourning were over, and I want to stress, not everyone was expected to do this. You had to be wealthy to do this, but you should do something to show your regret at having lost your parents and the kind of guilt because you weren't able to keep them alive a bit longer. Eventually, you would switch over to ancestor rites when that period of mourning was over. And basically, at certain times of the year, you would perform rituals in honor of the deceased, especially your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents and so on, your ancestors. And these rituals, you would offer food and you would offer incense for those spirits. And what's complex about this, some people believe that the spirits actually entered the tablets. You had these like wooden tablets that you would set up with the deceased names on it. Some people thought that they entered the tablets and actually ate the spiritual nature of the food. Others did not believe that. But as part of the ritual, right, you would make this offering, you would bow, and then together as a family, you would eat the food. And this is very important. The idea here is that by making this offering of food, that by and bowing, you would also bow in front of the tablet. You were respecting hierarchy. You were showing that you respected hierarchy, and that was a very important virtue in a hierarchical society, right? So it's important to note these rituals reinforced social norms that help keep this society together. Korea is very hierarchical. This ritual encouraged people to respect hierarchy, and that was considered a virtue. And you can see how engaging this virtue or in this ritual in bowing and offering food and incense to your ancestors would encourage you to respect that hierarchy. It would encourage filial piety, love, honor, and respect you owe your parents, right? You're showing that love by trying to feed them, even though they're dead. So you can see how these rituals were meant to make you more virtuous. They help you respect hierarchy. They remind you of your place, that you're supposed to love and serve the people above you. So again, these are very important rituals. In addition, of course, performing the ritual together and eating the food together encouraged family harmony and family solidarity. Right? You brought everyone together for these rituals from all over the country sometimes. So that's also very important. So it's key to understand these rituals were believed, and I think to a large extent, actually developed these virtues. Now, one thing I want to stress, though, that this is, again, very important for understanding how Neo-Confucianism could be different from the way we understand things in the United States. So imagine this. Let's say your friend invites you to church, and at church they have communion. If you don't believe in Christianity, you're probably going to refuse communion. And depending on the church's rules, they may say, yeah, if you don't believe, you shouldn't take communion. So typically, our understanding of things in the West is that belief determines action. So if I believe in Christianity, I would accept communion. And if you're not familiar with this term, I'm talking about the grape juice or the wine, depending on what church, and the crackers or the bread that are given in remembrance of Jesus' Last Supper. If you were an atheist, you would probably say, I should not receive this because I don't believe in this religion, I don't believe in these ideas, I'm just visiting the church. Right? And a Christian would probably respect that because they would agree with the atheist that belief determines action. For Neo-Confucians, that doesn't make any sense. You could get up and say, I don't believe that the spirits actually come down and eat the food, and no one would really care. The government wouldn't care. On the other hand, if you said, because the spirits don't eat the food, I'm not going to take part in these rituals, then the government would care. The government would say, it doesn't matter what you believe about these rituals. What matters is that you perform them because these rituals do something to you, right? They encourage you to respect hierarchy. And if you don't respect your parents, you won't respect the king. Right? So this is very important for us to understand. In Western thought, usually, belief determines action. For Neo-Confucians, it's quite the opposite. They are not concerned with belief. The effects, if a ritual has positive effects, it's a good ritual, it's doing what it's supposed to. So it doesn't matter if you believe whether the spirits are there or not. What matters is that you perform the ritual, you show your respect for hierarchy, you become more hierarchical, you learn to recognize the grace you receive from the people above you, and you show them love, honor, respect. That's what's important. That's what's fundamentally important, not whether you believe or not, or the spirits.